swiftly on to Damon Barrett, who's going to talk more about the human rights and policy. So Damon, thank you.
Thanks very much. I'm actually not sure that's what I'm going to talk about anymore. I was really thinking about what to say. This is an area I've been working in for almost 10 years, specifically on human rights and applying that to drug control. Most often in the field of harm reduction, which I think is very close to a definition of a human rights-based approach to drug control, by the way, when viewed properly. No, normally, people that know me know that I normally speak quite hyperbolically about the war on drugs. I'm going to, I think this time, switch to something I think quite practical. I want to switch from whether criminalization's failed, I think Peter dismantled it pretty well, to why it fails and how that generates human rights problems. So, first thing we just have to be very clear with and honest with ourselves, okay, is that we do not criminalize drugs the way we criminalize burglary or assault. It's not done because these things deserve punishment for themselves, right? The criminalization of drug use, drug possession, is a strategy for achieving a social goal, right? So it's the use of the criminal law for the achievement of a social goal, okay? So, it's a compliance regime. You're trying to get people to comply or change their behavior using the criminal law. So with any compliance regime, you have to look at the various barriers that people will face in complying, okay? Now this isn't my work, this is taking other people's work and applying it to this sector, right? So there's lots of these barriers. I don't have time to go through all of them. They range from peer effects that I think Peter talked very well about, what your friends and colleagues do and so on, to cognitive barriers and so on. I want to talk mainly about incentives and sanctions because we're talking about criminalization. But within that, I want to talk about monitoring problems, enforcement problems, autonomy problems, and how we talk about what we call the target population. So, there are only two main sanctions to our drug policies. There's no incentives, right? We have a sanction of criminalization and we have a sanction of social opprobrium, stigma, right? These are our sanctions. Now, like I said, there's no incentive. If you have the sanction of criminalization, then it brings in the question of can you monitor the behavior and can you enforce it? You can't monitor it. There's too many people doing it. It's criminalized, so you've made it hidden. You can't do it. It's too widespread. Okay? And because it can't be monitored, it can't be enforced uniformly. So what that means is that punishment becomes, first of all, selective. More visible populations, people who are living in poorer neighborhoods, people who are on the streets. In certain countries, people who are from minority ethnic groups. They're the ones who bear the brunt because you can't uniformly do it. And second of all, instead of certainty of punishment, which all criminologists know is better than severity of punishment, we move towards severity of punishment to send a message. And now we're in real trouble because we're completely perverting what the criminal law is for. Instead of punishing crimes, we're setting an example. What you're doing, and this ranges from the very extreme, executing people in various countries, right? Detention centers, very long prison sentences in some places, to criminal records itself. If you look at a possession offense, a criminal record for that's going to stick with you, unless you're a minor, for the rest of your life, right? And it will affect your whole family for that period of time. That's a severe punishment for what you've done. And if anyone disbelieves that, just imagine getting one and what that will do. You can't go to the United States of America if you have a criminal record for drugs. On the list of things, that little yellow green form, you have to say, have you done this, this, and this? It begins with, have you committed acts of genocide? Then it says, were you ever a Nazi? Then it says, were you ever convicted of a drug offense? I always wonder, does anyone ever take, yeah, well, I was a Nazi. I did a bit of genocide in the 1930s. Anyway, so we have monitoring and enforcement problems. We've got our certainty of punishment moving to selectivity and towards severity, right? And I think we've got the perversion of the criminal law. Now, here's the other thing. The classic definition of an autonomy barrier is addiction, right? Because you're telling people, under pain of punishment, criminal punishment, that they have to stop doing what they're doing, while at the same time accepting that, at least for the time being, they don't have as much control over it as you would like them to have. right? Meanwhile, as Peter mentioned, there's no way, the treatment is very, very poor. So there's an irony in that, because the people who we're talking about here are not all drug users, the majority of whom don't need treatment. It's people with drug problems in whose name these laws are put in place, which is, again, a perverting, I think, of the criminal law. So that's our first sanction. It doesn't work and it produces human rights problems. I mean, even look at that monitoring problem, right? If you can't monitor, you start to adopt more intrusive means to try to monitor, just to see, okay? So an example from, I don't know what happened, I don't live in Ireland anymore, I live in Sweden, but an example from other countries, right? In schools say we want to keep drugs out of our schools, so we get random school drug testing. And we get sniffer dogs in schools, and we get strip searches and searches of kids' bags and so on. That's to try and deal with this monitoring problem, because they can't do it. Now, that's our first sanction. The next one was social opprobrium. Now these days, even our politicians will say, oh, we shouldn't stigmatize people. You know, we shouldn't stigmatize people. And even in the area I work in a lot, in HIV, stigma is well known to be a barrier to dealing with the global epidemic. Everybody knows it. Social opprobrium or stigma is an intended component of a strategy of criminalization. Intended. It's not an accidental side effect that you criminalize a behavior and the people who engage in that behavior become stigmatized. Right? That this is intended because it's the idea, or at least the theory that doesn't work, is that the entire society will go against that behavior and nobody does it. Well, that's not what happens. What you do is you create us and them. That's what you do. And once you do that, you find people are on the outside. And it's not all drug users. It's certain kinds of drug users. In the US, it's black crack users instead of white cocaine users. Here, it might be the street-based heroin user instead of the college-based cocaine user. I don't know the dynamics here, right? But it's certain types of people who bear the brunt of it. And they bear the brunt of the stigma and the social opprobrium. And then that comes to this question of how you talk about the target population. Because on top of the stigma, we talk about drugs as a threat, which means that people who are engaged in all of the behaviors around drugs are components of the threat. Now, if you do that, we know from all areas of human rights, repression against those people and abuses against them is very, very easy, and it's very easy to justify, and not many people will jump to their defense. A further example of that Peter mentioned and is in terms of resources. This symposium is called Help Not Harm, right? There's a budgetary call there. Help instead of harm. You see, if you have set those people on the outside, if you've set up a threat, and if you've set up a threat, then justifying repression is considerably easier than asking the taxpayer to pay for services for the same people you just set on the outside and blamed for all of these problems. And that again leads us to a serious human rights problem. Now, this is where I'll go a little bit more towards my hyperbole. I've been thinking for a long time about what exactly is wrong with the war on drugs from a human rights perspective. And I started with all of the litany of abuse that there is. Name your human rights abuse, and in some country it's happening. From execution to denial of health care, right? It's happening all the time. In fact, today, on average, 2 or 3 people will be executed for drug offenses. So this is happening right now. It was that at the beginning, and then I started looking at how our laws and our policies construct a system within which these abuses are made worse. And now I've moved on even further. And I'm now convinced that the war on drugs is the opposite of everything human rights is intended to be. Human rights is intended to at least give us some distance between our own protections and the overreach of state power into our lives and the arbitrary or capricious use of that power. And at the same time, to borrow from Michael D. Higgins, to create a social floor beneath which nobody should be allowed to fall. What we do is we push people through a hole in that social floor, and we spend all of the money on the state agencies of repression rather than health and care. And that's what the war on drugs does, and I think that's the ultimate challenge for me. Thank you.
Thank you, Damon. We have run over time, but I would just take one question and then maybe you can ask further questions after the next group. The gentleman here, yes.
It's not so much a question, it's a comment, and it's based on the fact, and please don't take this as a criticism, the number of times that misuse and problem were used in your, what would I call them, speeches. But not all use of drugs or illegal drugs is misuse or problem. In fact, there's a large and ever-growing number of people like myself involved in the production and use of illegal drugs for medicinal purposes. And that's something that really is a breach of human rights. So many times you've spoken about it. But that needs to be taken into account as well.
Yes.
And we are criminals too.
Yeah. But thank you for mentioning that, because I think the language we use is so important. And I don't know if you notice, I tend to use